Hey, Dad. Today we're going to be talking about something that's there's not a lot of fun stuff in it. So we're going to be talking about the pro-Palestinian protests that are happening in the colleges right now, how they relate to other stuff, and how policing and capitalism relate to them. So just this isn't going to be one where we have a lot of like fun asides, like the bees. This is going to be, I'm going to outline 3 protests that are in different parts of the country. What's going on with them, and then after that, I'm going to compare some of the motivations and responses of the different schools. So that said, this is my serious outfit. Let's go. It is spring. Love is in the air. Pollen is too. And university students are doing what university students do in the spring. They are protesting. This is not a new thing. Protests happen all the time, all across the world. And one of the reasons you see a lot of them happen in spring is because kids are off during summer. And in the winter, it's super cold and kind of hard to do that. Fall's kind of messed up too. So the spring, you're getting towards the end of the year. Sun starts coming back, flooded with vitamin D. So historically, we've seen a lot of protests in the springtime. The protests that are happening right now are specifically around the Israeli-Gaza conflict. Right now it's happening between Israel in retribution for Hamas's terrorist attack of October 7th. There's a ton of backstory. It goes back thousands of years. It's so complicated to get into what's happening in the Middle East and just kind of, let's play with just the last 6 months. It's really hard to do. So if you want greater context on this, I highly recommend the documentary 1948 Creation of Catastrophe. It interviews people that were in the Israeli army. It interviews Palestinians that were pushed out of their homes in what was called the Nakba, or catastrophe. So let me be clear that I do not think that Hamas was in the right in any way. But what's happened after that, where Israel could have had a clear PR win by going after Hamas, taking out terrorist cells, taking out the terrorist leaders, what's happened instead is they've gone into Gaza and they're bombing with dumb bombs. They're targeting homes when they know the husband or father is going to be home, and they're killing civilians knowingly. There's a call by the UN for a ceasefire. There's a war crimes allegations happening at the International Criminal Court. So what Israel is doing in response to Hamas is against all of Palestine. They're invading and encroaching in Gaza, and they're probably going to do a land attack in Rafah, which would be catastrophic to the people that live there. So what I will say, and what I will frame my position on this, is that I do not think that the response that Israel is using against Gaza is proportional to the attack by terrorists inside of the Palestinian territory. That said, I want to frame something else here, because this is going to come up later on as we talk about these protests. The American Jewish Committee says that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. I do not believe that is the case. I believe that is a false conflation that Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, is doing as well. A lot of the right-wing sources on that side are conflating them. Anti-Semitism is a kind of racism. It's being against Jewish people for their faith and their ethnicity. Anti-Zionism is saying, we need to figure out a way to stop Israel from continuing to take land from the Palestinian settlements and turning it into de facto Israeli territory. We need to try and end the apartheid that is currently occurring and has this situation coming out of it. So anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are not equivalent. The American Jewish Committee goes on to say, the belief that Jews alone among the people of the world do not have a right to self-determination, or that Jewish people's religious and historical connection to Israel is invalid, is inherently bigoted. They're making a straw man argument here. because anti-Zionisms do not say Israel has to go find something else. Israel has to give up Israel. Anti-Zionists are saying you shouldn't be bringing people to Israel and then helping them settle in Palestinian territory. So they're not the same. So this stuff is super complicated, and I wanted to step in and clarify my statements because in watching them during the edit, I realized I was unclear and I didn't say some of the things that I meant to say about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism can be anti-Semitic, and it is sometimes used as code for being anti-Semitic without being overtly anti-Semitic. It's even more complicated than that because the original idea of anti-Zionism is a Jewish idea. It came around when they were trying to figure out what Jewish identity meant to them, and in conversations, some of them said, the homeland's not the important part. Having the land back isn't as important as being Jewish and being true to the covenant with the Lord. Anti-Zionism has also been used in kind of two ways. One of them is the return to the homeland, to go back to Zion and that idea. But now it's got kind of this more complicated context because of the recolonization of parts of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. As they continue to expand, that's some of the stuff that's being pushed back against, but I think that's unclear. So let's dial back on some of the stuff I said as absolute, because none of this is. It's all messy. And even just watching myself, I went, you're off a little bit. So I've trimmed it down, but the bit that you just saw is the sentiment that's kind of boiling around. And you want to be able to separate anti-Zionism, anti-Semitic, pro-Palestinian, and pro-Hamas, as well as pro-Israeli and pro-Zionist. Those are all different things. And the nuance and flow on that spectrum and the continued reduction and conflation of them is problematic for the conversation. So this is an insert just to give that nuance and say, anti-Zionism can be anti-Semitic, but is not always so. Pro-Palestinian can be pro-Hamas, but is not always so. There's that fluctuation, there's that difference, there's that nuance. And that's part of what's, I believe, needs to be reintroduced in this conversation instead of the all or nothing. So that's my insert. I wanted to clarify that anti-Zionism is sometimes anti-Semitic. Right now, it quite often is, to be honest. But anti-Zionism is a much more complicated precept than just a kind of anti-Semitism. It's really about where a Jewish state should exist, and if a Jewish state should exist, how big it should be. Should it be in Rafah? Should it be in Gaza? Should it be in the West Bank? Or should it just be where it is now? And those borders have changed. They've shifted. There's been several wars over it. So continuing with the episode, that's my insert. We'll see if the rest of it, as I watch it, makes me come down here and record something else. Enjoy. I would call out that Hamas and Palestine are not the same. Yes, Hamas was voted in to rule Palestine, but there's a big history around that too that has to do with even Bibi Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, wanted that so he could consolidate right-wing power. That's a very complicated piece. Hamas's incursion into Israel on October 7th was an atrocious act of terrorism, and everybody responsible for it should be rounded up and held to account. At the same time, the over 30,000 dead, with a majority civilians, and the over 70,000 wounded, with the majority civilians, that have been carried out by Israel in such a way that they have killed aid workers and they have blocked food from coming into the area, which is a war crime, should be held to account. And that's where I think you start to get and should be thinking about when we talk about the people that are protesting. When we're sitting here in the United States and we have a roof over our heads, our grocery stores are full. If anything, we're kvetching about the cost of eggs and bacon. That's baloney. When right now we're spending billions of dollars on two sides of a conflict, On the one hand, we're giving Israel billions of dollars in munitions and aid to protect themselves, but they're using it to attack a conquered people, a people who are living in a condition of abject poverty and control of another country. We, at the same time, are trying like hell to get Palestinians food. Problem is, when we're airdropping food in, it's hard for Palestinians to know if that is food or a bomb. We're building a floating pier to try and get stuff in because we can't bring it in through land routes because Israel won't let us. So that's the mindset of these protesters. Let's take a second and talk about college students. This is my stack of degrees, right? So this one's New York, this one's San Francisco. That's not San Francisco, there's San Francisco. That's my favorite one. Arnold Schwarzenegger signed it because he was governor at the time. So I went to school and lived in San Francisco. While I was there, Gavin Newsom said, hey, gay marriage is fine here. We will do it. Doesn't matter what the world says. We're going to let it happen. And that kicked off this huge fight for civil rights and gay marriage equality that ended in the Obergefell v. Hodges decision, which legalized it nationwide. I was in those protests. I went and marched, but the whole city felt the same way. So if there was any police, well, there was police presence, but they were just there to make sure there wasn't anything getting out of hand when that many people are around, like you would have security at a giant festival. It had that kind of an environment. When I was at NYU, I protested there too. And it's weird because NYU is in the city in such a way that if you're going to gather, you're probably going to do it at Washington Square, which is part of the city of New York. It's not really the quad of NYU. It just happens to be centrally located on the NYU's major campus parts, because the campuses are just parts of city blocks that have been taken over. And there we had no problems. The police were there. But I saw the same police presence for the protests that I was a part of at Washington Square as I did for the Underwear Run 5K, where we ran in our underwear up and down the streets of New York. Very similar police presence. So that in mind, let's talk about a couple of schools and what's happened there. The president of Columbia was called to testify about anti-Semitism on college campuses. That phrasing and saying anti-Semitism on college campuses is the beginning of a giveaway of how this is being looked at by the powers that be in Washington and the financial powers that be across the country. When they say anti-Semitism, they are leaning into what the American Jewish Committee says, that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Because most of what we're seeing on college campuses, including from Jewish students, is appall at what's happened to the civilians in Gaza. And that's being responded to as, well, you're pro-Hamas. No, they are not pro-Hamas. They are pro-civilians not dying in wartime. And as students, as people who have spent the last 2, 3, 4 years deeply involved in ideas, deeply involved in learning how to get along with other people, and often deeply involved in the political and legal underpinnings of our system, they look at that and they go, this isn't right, what can we do? And in the same way that in the 1960s, when they didn't like that the Vietnam War was happening, they protest. And the great majority of time, these protests are peaceful. When they turn violent, it tends to be in relationship to, in this case of protests, police involvement or counter-protesters being allowed to clash without police involvement. So this sets kind of that role and responsibility for police conduct in these matters. We'll get into that in a second. So April 24th, the president of Columbia University, Manish Shafik, was called on to testify. She went in and she testified, and they asked her specifically about pro-Palestinian encampments, because as she was going to testify on Capitol Hill, a bunch of Columbia students went, this would be a good time to get press on this because it plays really well against her testifying. So cool, let's go bring attention to the Palestinian cause. And they set up camp. While she was on the way back, she had them cleared. She had the police come and clear them off. It is said that there were negotiations, but my understanding of these negotiations from a couple of sources that I've seen on Vox and Slate are that the first offer was get off the lawn, and the second offer was get off the lawn and be expelled. Something along those lines. It went from bad to worse. And the counter was, we're here protesting and we're asking a very simple ask. We want to discuss divestment of the Columbia Endowment from anything that supports the war in Israel. That's what they wanted to have a discussion about. So she had them cleared, and in response to that, a whole bunch more Columbia students showed up. And those Columbia students took over a building. They took over a building, and on April 30th, the NYPD, using armored vehicles and riot gear, cleared them out. When they cleared them out, one of the New York Police Department discharged his gun in the hall that they had occupied. We were this close to having a student shot on campus by a police officer. And that's right in line with something that happened back in the 60s, when National Guard troops were called out and they fired on Kent State. And there were several students who lost their lives and several students who were injured. Why does that echo? Why does this rhythm of the conversation come back and hit again? Why are we at the same cusp where the people that we've trained, taught, and are trusting to lead the future of our country, we say, you're totally wrong, get off campus? At this point, there have been over 2,000 arrests across the United States at different universities. There have been several clashes where they were cleared with riot gear. Let's talk about UCLA for a second. Some of these photos are from a friend of mine, Andy Tremlett, and he helped work on 1948 creation of catastrophe. I highly recommend you go check it out. It really gives a background to where this thing all sprung from. It gets complicated in the intervening 60-some years, but it'll give you an idea of where this started. So, UCLA. They had a remarkably peaceful protest. There was a point, though, on the night after these photos were taken, where agitators, pro-Israeli, I'd call it, though it's more like anti-Palestine. I don't know. That's a phrasing question that's right up there with trying to do pro-life, pro-choice kind of stuff. So what I will say is that you have the pro-Palestine encampment, and the people were opposed to what they were doing and came in masked and started trying to tear down the encampment. While they were trying to tear down the encampment, campus security was trying to figure out what to do. And they waited for almost an hour before they called in the police. By the time the LAPD got there, they still sat around, and this conflict went on for hours. Everybody's critiquing, trying to figure out why it took so long to resolve. And that delay, followed by incarceration, is what some of these kids are going to get instead of a degree and a graduation. Commencements are being canceled all across the country. That's when these speeches should happen. That's when these conversations should happen. These should echo on the ground up into the halls of power where they're insulated from a lot of the effects of these things. They're not thinking about them in the same way. And here's why I say they're not thinking of them in the same way. In Columbia, the total value of their endowment as of June 30th, 2023, this is just a block of money they have that's being invested and managed, was $13.64 billion. They produced a return of 4.5% on the managed assets. Trailing 10-year return is 8%. In fiscal year 23, $632 million was distributed from the endowment in support of students, faculty, and university activities for a 5.2% effective spending rate. That block of money is a huge block of money, and the managers that take care of that money invest it in funds. Those funds invest in other funds. And it gets to this point where it's like a Russian Matryoshka doll, and you can't tell where the money actually is. But if you try hard, you can. We've had 2 successful divestments due to protests in the last 50 years that I know of. There may be more, but there's 2 key ones I don't want to talk about. In 1986, There was over $3 billion divested due to protests about apartheid in South Africa. They were saying apartheid is wrong. We should not have any of the college's money anywhere near anything like that. And they went through and they talked to all the funds and they did the work and they were able to divest. The other one happened a couple of years ago when Harvard, in response to protests, said, yeah, we're going to divest from fossil fuels. And in the same way that you ask a college student to show their work so you can understand their thinking, that's what college students are asking the money part of this endowment to do. Show your work so we can understand how you got there and what we're funding. Because if you're a student at Columbia, at UCLA, at UCSD, at any of these schools where this is happening, it's hard to say you don't carry some portion of the guilt if 1% of $13.64 billion, 1% is $136 million, is somewhere helping to fund and destroy civilian lives. Now, I know that if the other side happened, if we found any trace of a link of funds to Hamas, it would be divested instantaneously. And I understand that it's more complicated when you're talking about the Israeli economy and the Israeli government. But you can divest from all of the war-related pieces. You can divest from all of the things that support and fund this, and at the same time put more pressure on our current administration to divest from those same things, to stop funding certain kinds of weaponry for the Israeli military. They shouldn't have some of those bombs. They should have all the self-defense stuff they need. The Iron Dome is awesome. That is a good idea. That's their missile system that shot all the stuff from Iran out of the sky. They're pretty safe from traditional attacks. What we saw on October 7th is they're not super safe from planned coordinated terrorist attacks. But as a country who had a planned coordinated terrorist attack happen on our soil, and in response went into one of the world's longest and most costly wars that was one-sided, our time in Afghanistan and Iraq and Iran, we spent so much money. We went in and did all that, and I'm still not convinced that we were right. I'm still not convinced that weapons of mass destruction was a viable reason. And that's the concern that college students have now. Is what Israel's doing in Gaza make any sense as a response to what occurred? It does if you believe that all Palestinians are responsible for the actions of a few. I don't think that's fair. Let's talk about a couple other campuses. Because there are other ways to do this. This response with police in riot gear, clearing out and tear gassing and rubber bullets and coming in and taking these people into custody, that doesn't feel like the right response. When you hear about what, say, Brown had protests in the same time frame as Columbia. These protests have been going on back and forth for quite a while since this happened. October 7th, everybody was on Israel's side. Absolutely without question, they should punish Hamas. They should find who did this. They should get the hostages back. Now that they've killed 35,000 Palestinians and injured another 70,000 more, this doesn't feel like a balanced, measured, or controlled response. So, Brown had protests in the same time frame, and the Board of Trustees at Brown said, we're not going to vote on divestment. We're not going to consider divestment. They continued dialogue in good faith. And the conclusion of that dialogue in good faith was, you guys clear the encampment, agree to let's do the rest of the school year, we'll get to commencement, and at the next meeting of the board, we'll vote on divestment. We'll have the discussion. They're not even saying they're going to do it. They're just opening to the idea of having the conversation. If Columbia had done that, if Columbia had stepped in and said, you know what? Okay, let's have the conversation. Why do you think this is important? How would we do it? What level of divestment are you asking for? Is it just the military-industrial part? Is it all of Israel? You can have that conversation. Columbia didn't. They arrested them. They sent in police with tear gas and guns. And one of the police shot his gun during the clearing of the occupied hall. Sorry. We have a couple of examples closer home. At both UCSD and San Diego State University in San Diego, there are currently protests. Those protests have continued to be peaceful. There have not been police called in to clear them. They continue to have discussions around what the demands are of the students. That feels like a learning experience to me. A lot more than one where you get arrested and taken off to jail, because then you're just learning that the power of the state is more important than you are. I didn't want to have to come back down here, but while I was editing this thing, they cleared the encampment at UCSD. A bunch of the students are now not only arrested, they're on interim suspension, and they're talking about moving to different kinds of learning modes to keep people off campus. So congratulations, state, you notched up another win. Were you not paying attention? If I had gotten this out faster, I don't think it would have helped. Here goes the rest. The choices of those in charge are more important than the conversations of those that disagree. I got a text message from Daryl Issa, who's out in San Diego. And in it, he says, there's anti-Semitic protests all over the US. Let's stop the radical left. Guess what, Daryl? They're not anti-Semitic. They're a conversation that we need to have about the nuance and the complications of funding the murder of civilians. On both sides, we have no money in Hamas. We will not support them. Iran does. Part of why we don't like Iran. But Israel has killed civilians now. This imbalance is frustrating. The way that this comes out in the media and becomes propagandized on either side for political ends is understandable. That is politics. But the failure to have or engage in a pedantic, student-like conversation is problematic. There is nuance and complication to this, and I highly recommend if you want to get deeper into this current conversation, you should read a couple of things that I read. You should be looking at Slate, you should be reading Vox, and you should also be looking at Salon. They've been covering this in a very good way. There's an article that talks about kids being kids, about why college kids will protest and why we should let them, even if it's stupid stuff. There's an article on there where it talks through the roots of all of this. And there are a lot of articles on there that talk about the difficulty in getting aid to Gaza. There are a lot of articles on there that talk about the possibility of war crime charges for the Israeli government at the International Criminal Court. The nuance of a conversation around genocide is happening there as well. For this piece around the current protests and what's happening, I want to leave with an idea about how I see this. And when I look at the balance of power between the administration and the students, it's vast. And when you have that big of a gulf of power, it is the responsibility of those in power to be accountable to the agency of those in their charge. That does not mean your first response is violent. That does not mean that your first response is to take the police that are a weapon of force for the state to protect your capital at the expense of the exchange of ideas and understanding with those in your charge. So I make this ask to the university presidents that are looking at this and trying to figure it out, as well as to the police that are responding to these asks. When you arrive, police, your role is to maintain order. Please try to maintain order. And for those presidents, if any of them happen to be watching, I don't know why you would, but if you found me for some reason or it's been sent to you, engage in the conversation. I'm asking you to step back from your current conclusion that you are absolutely right and have your ideas challenged. by these kids that we're trusting to take care of the world tomorrow before we break them. In solidarity with the protesters on campus, I am Justin Libernet, and this has been Weekly Dad News. Good night.